The chamber of the Zarkari War Council was an immense, domed sanctum of polished obsidian and pulsating bioluminescent veins. The air was thick with the scent of burning minerals, a deliberate choice meant to intimidate those who entered. Towering Zarkari warlords, their bodies plated in organic armor, stood in a semicircle around the central dais, where a holographic projection of the galactic front blinked with ominous red indicators. They spoke in sharp, guttural tones, discussing strategies, dismissing humanity's resistance as a soon-to-be-forgotten nuisance. Then, the doors groaned open. A figure stood at the threshold, framed by the cold, sterile light of the hallway beyond. He was alone. No herald, no diplomatic escort, no shackles. Just a human, clad in torn, soot-streaked combat armor, the insignia of a long-defeated Earth battalion barely visible beneath the grime. His left arm hung limp, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. Yet, his right hand held something far more disturbing than any weapon. The severed head of the Supreme Overlord. It was not a trick, not some grotesque imitation. The head bore the unmistakable ridged crown of the Zarkari sovereign, its elongated mandibles frozen in a final silent snarl. One of its 3 eyes had been crushed, the others glazed over in the murky stillness of death. The sight of it sent a ripple through the chamber, first a breathless, stunned silence, then the crackling hiss of disbelief, and finally, the roar of outrage. Weapons were drawn. Zarkari enforcers moved forward with their plasma lances raised, but the human did not flinch. He took 3 steps forward, his boots leaving a trail of darkened blood across the gleaming obsidian floor. With calculated precision, he lifted the Overlord's head and let it fall onto the war table with a sickening thud. The impact sent shockwaves through the council, both literal and symbolic. A head of state did not simply fall, not to a lone human, not within the heart of the Empire itself. A deep, resonant voice shattered the stunned silence. This is a deception. The speaker was High Warlord Vosrath, his exoskeletal plating gleaming beneath the chamber's cold light. His 6 fingers clenched into fists as he stepped forward, his massive frame dwarfing the human. The Supreme Overlord cannot be slain by one such as you. This is impossible. The human exhaled, slow and measured before speaking. And yet, here I stand. His voice was hoarse, weathered by exhaustion, but there was steel beneath it. Here he lies. Murmurs swept through the gathered warlords. Some took a step back, wary. Others snarled, their tusks bared in fury. Vosratha's 4 burning eyes narrowed. This is an act of war. The human's lips curled into something that might have been a smile if not for the blood staining his teeth. No. This, he gestured to the Overlord's lifeless gaze, is the war you started. The one you thought was already won. He took another step forward. None of them had yet attacked him. That was something. The Supreme Overlord called us insects. He called us vermin. He sent fleets to burn our worlds and laughed while we choked on the ash. The human's voice did not rise, yet it carried through the chamber with the weight of a funeral bell. Your empire expected us to die quietly. Instead, I stand here with the head of the one who led the charge against my people. Vosratha's mandibles clicked in agitation. You dare challenge the Zarkari Imperium alone? The human's expression hardened. You misunderstand. He slowly raised his injured arm, revealing a small device strapped to his wrist. With a flick of his fingers, the holographic display above the war table flickered and changed. Where once the Empire's battle lines had been solid, unwavering, now there were breaches. Countless breaches. Human forces had infiltrated deep, far beyond what the warlords had anticipated. Cities on once untouchable worlds burned. Starships fell. The impossible had become real. I am not alone, the human said, his voice soft now, almost reverent. I am just the first. The warlords stared at the shifting display. It was not a trick, not a fabricated illusion. The tide was turning, and they had not seen it coming. Some of them turned toward Vosrath, awaiting his command. Others looked at one another, uncertainty creeping into their expressions. Doubt, the deadliest of poisons, had entered the veins of the Empire. The human took one final step, closing the space between himself and the war table. He placed his bloodied hand on its surface, smearing crimson across the smooth obsidian. You can still fight, he said, his voice a whisper of something cold and inevitable. You can throw your armies against us. But know this. He leaned in slightly, his exhausted yet unbroken eyes locking onto Vosratha's burning gaze. We do not stop. We do not break. You will all fall. A hush settled over the council, thick and suffocating. The Overlord's severed head lay between them all, a grim totem of everything they had failed to foresee. The human had come not to beg, not to negotiate, but to warn them. And warnings, when ignored, became prophecy. Vosratha's claws twitched, his nostrils flaring as he stared at the human with something approaching, respect. Or perhaps fear. The silence stretched. And stretched. Then, somewhere in the vast chamber, a single warlord stepped back. Then another. And another. The cracks had begun to form. The wind howled through the shattered ruins of the Overlord's sanctum, carrying with it the acrid scent of charred metal and the coppery tang of spilled blood. The human crouched behind a collapsed pillar, his chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. His armor was cracked, his left gauntlet completely missing, exposing torn flesh and the raw burn of cauterized wounds. The weight of exhaustion pressed against his bones, but he could not afford to falter. Not yet. Not when he was this close. The Supreme Overlord stood at the heart of the ruined chamber, an imposing figure bathed in the flickering glow of failing containment shields. His exoskeletal frame was draped in regal battle plating, dark as the void and adorned with sigils of conquest. His four burning eyes fixed upon the lone human with a mixture of amusement and disdain. "You should not have come," the Overlord rumbled, his voice a deep, resonant growl that seemed to shake the very walls around them. The human wiped blood from his brow, blinking away the sting of sweat and dirt. "Funny," he muttered, adjusting his grip on the combat knife that was now his only weapon. "That's exactly what your war council is about to say to you." The Overlord stepped forward, each movement exuding power and certainty. "Your kind does not understand the weight of inevitability. Empires do not fall because of insects gnawing at their edges." He flexed his clawed hands, the air shimmering with the energy field surrounding him. "You are an anomaly. A momentary disruption. But nothing more." The human exhaled slowly, centering himself. He had no grand speeches left, no words that could shake an enemy who had raised entire civilizations without remorse. There was only action now. A final, desperate act of defiance. He lunged. The Overlord was fast, faster than any being of his size had the right to be. The first strike came like lightning, a sweeping claw that tore through empty air as the human twisted to the side, rolling beneath the monstrous reach. He lashed out, the knife glancing off the Overlord's plated arm with a shower of sparks. A fraction of a second later, a backhanded strike caught the human square in the ribs, sending him hurtling across the room. He crashed into a fallen support beam, pain exploding through his side. He had broken something. Maybe several things. The Overlord did not gloat. He simply advanced. "Do you see now?" he asked, voice almost gentle, as if speaking to a child. "There was never a path where you left this place alive." The human coughed, tasting blood. He forced himself to his feet, bracing against the beam as he glared at his enemy. "Then I'll just have to settle for making sure you don't leave either." With the last of his strength, he activated the failsafe. A sequence of explosives, carefully planted along the chamber's structural weak points, hummed to life. The Overlord's gaze flicked toward the shifting glow of detonators, his mandibles clicking in mild surprise. For the first time, the Supreme Overlord hesitated. The human smiled, bloody and defiant. "Looks like inevitability has a funny way of changing sides." The chamber erupted in a cascade of fire and collapsing stone. The explosion roared through the sanctum, a shock wave of destruction tearing through walls that had stood for centuries. The Overlord staggered, caught in the force of the blast, his armor scorched, his regal plating fractured. For the first time, the Supreme Overlord bled. The human surged forward through smoke and flame, ignoring the searing pain in his limbs. He leaped onto the wounded warlord, driving his knife deep between the plates of his neck. The Overlord roared, a sound of rage and disbelief, his claws closing around the human's arm in a crushing grip. But the damage had been done. The blade twisted, severing tendons, breaching the hardened layers of his exoskeleton. The Supreme Overlord fell to his knees. His eyes, once burning with absolute certainty, dimmed. The human wrenched the knife free, barely registering the blood pooling around him. The Overlord's breath hitched, his form trembling, his once mighty presence reduced to fading embers. "You are not supposed to win," he rasped. The human crouched before him, their gazes locking. "Neither were we supposed to die quietly." With one final motion, he severed the Overlord's head. The body collapsed, lifeless. The warlord who had commanded the annihilation of entire planets lay in the ruins of his own domain. The weight of victory pressed upon the human's shoulders, but he had no time to savor it. No time to grieve his fallen comrades, whose sacrifice had made this moment possible. He forced himself to stand, lifting the Overlord's head by its ridged crown. The flames cast shifting shadows across its lifeless eyes. He had done the impossible. But the war was far from over. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he turned toward the exit. It was time to deliver a message. The doors to the War Council's chamber groaned as they slid open, the weight of the moment heavier than the reinforced metal that had once sealed it. The gathered warlords, a congregation of the supreme overlord's most ruthless generals and strategists, turned as one. Their dark robes and battle-scarred armor reflected the dim glow of the chamber's overhead lights. The room, once a place where galactic conquests were orchestrated with ruthless efficiency, now fell into a stunned, unnatural silence. A lone human stepped inside. His battered armor bore the marks of a battle fought far beyond the capabilities of ordinary men. Blood, some his, some not, streaked across his face and arms, a testament to the impossible struggle that had brought him here. But it was the thing in his hands that stole the breath from every being present. The supreme overlord's severed head. He gripped it by the ridged crown, its weight a sickening reminder of what had been lost and won. The overlord's once burning eyes were dark now, his mandibles slack, his expression frozen in a mixture of rage and disbelief. For decades, he had been the unchallenged force that bent entire civilizations to his will. Now, he was nothing more than a gruesome trophy in human hands. The warlords did not speak at first. Some barely breathed. Their ranks, filled with warriors of every species under the Empire's domain, had never conceived of such an event. The Overlord was power incarnate, his very presence enough to silence dissent. And yet, here he was, dead, defiled, and displayed before them by an insignificant creature from a world they had long considered beneath their notice. The human stepped forward. His gait was uneven, his body pushed beyond its limits, but his grip did not waver. He lifted the head higher, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Your emperor is dead." The words echoed through the vast chamber, reverberating in the minds of every being present. Some recoiled, others stiffened, their claws, tendrils, or mechanical appendages tightening in instinctive resistance. The warlords had slaughtered billions, razed entire fleets to dust, shattered planetary defenses without hesitation. But at this moment, faced with the undeniable reality before them, fear crept into the spaces where certainty had once lived. The human let the silence stretch, watching their reactions, feeling the weight of their hesitation. Then, with slow, deliberate intent, he dropped the head. It hit the floor with a dull, wet thud, rolling slightly before coming to a rest at the foot of the central dais. The finality of the act was absolute. A sharp, guttural sound broke the silence. A warlord, his carapace gleaming in the dim light, let out a snarl of pure rage. He stepped forward, towering over the human, his multi-jointed limbs flexing as he reached for the energy blade at his side. "You dare!" A single gunshot cracked through the air. The warlord jerked backward, a fresh hole smoldering in his forehead, and crumpled to the ground. Smoke curled from the human's sidearm as he lowered it with measured precision. "Yes," he said simply. The remaining warlords exchanged glances, their reactions betraying the fractures already forming in their once unified front. Some eyed their fallen comrade with cold calculation, while others seemed to reconsider the weight of their own mortality. The power they had worshipped, the Overlord's rule, had been proven fallible in the most brutal way possible. And now, the human stood before them as the harbinger of that change. He stepped forward again, his voice steady despite the fire burning through his battered body. "You can fight me," he said, his tone calm, almost inviting. "You can try to avenge him. You can send more ships, more armies, more war machines against us." He let the words settle, watching their expressions. "But you all saw what happened. You felt it. Your empire isn't unbreakable. Your leaders aren't untouchable." His eyes burned as he delivered the final blow. "And humans, we don't stop." The chamber remained eerily still, the warlords weighing their options. Some had already begun to shift away, their expressions betraying uncertainty. Others clung to the old ways, their hands twitching toward weapons they weren't sure they'd be fast enough to use. The human exhaled slowly. He had done what he came to do. Whether they chose to accept the truth or die resisting it was up to them. He turned, walking toward the massive doors that loomed at the far end of the chamber. Behind him, the silence shattered. A metallic clang echoed as one of the warlords dropped his weapon to the floor. Another followed. Then another. The sound of surrender, of realization, spread through the room like a ripple through space. The Empire's foundation had cracked. And soon, it would crumble.